Just a quick note before we begin, I read a lot of books this month and I'm going to get through them as quickly as possible. A lot of it was really, really good. I read my favourite book of the entire year this month, which I can't wait to talk about, although I have already done a review of it. But I'm just saying here, if you love what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I always welcome new patrons, and with my Patreon support, I am able to do things like put on ridiculous vampire makeup just to make a video. I wouldn't do something like that if I didn't have my Patreon. YouTube does not financially support me enough to do that, and I love my patrons. If you join the $10 or up tiers, you get to join an amazing monthly book club that I love hosting, but whatever you can give from $1 and up, I appreciate. I'm so grateful to my patrons. I love them all so much. Anyway, here's what I read in October. It's not Halloween anymore, but happy Halloween all the time. In terms of sheer numbers, I had a pretty amazing month. By my count, I read 12 novels and 3 manga. That's pretty good going, especially because one of the books is massive. Honestly scared to touch this stack. I'm just going to start at the top and work my way down, which makes this a weird place to start because I haven't finished this book yet. My review of it will be coming out very soon. This is Waiting for Ted by Marieka Big, published by Dead Ink Books, and what a job they have done with this cover. It is horrifying, and yet ordinary. This is a short novel that tells the story of a perfect modern suburban housewife who is kind of Instagram famous for documenting her perfect suburban life. And the novel is set over the course of one single day while she's waiting for her husband to come home, and she starts to wonder if he's going to come back at all, while she tells us about her life, how perfect it is, and how it has all started to fall apart. That's all I know, because I only just started it, but I can't wait to finish it and review it. This was an incredible book. This is Untold Microcosms. It is a collection of short fiction, essays, and memoirs by a range of legendary Latin American authors who were all invited to look at the Latin American collection of artifacts at the British Museum and talk about them. They talk about colonialism, they talk about empire, they talk about theft. They're very open with how they feel about these pieces, while also sometimes talking about the pieces themselves and how they inspire them, how they relate to their culture, and a lot of philosophy with regards to the concept of museums and artifacts. It's a really exciting thing. It's published by Charco Press, and I got to go to the big launch of it, which was at the British Museum. And it was an incredible evening. It was absolutely wonderful. Watching speeches, chatting to amazing, inspiring people, getting this book signed by multiple writers. Oh my goodness. If you care about Latin American culture, if you're interested in the concept of museums, the good and the bad, it's really electrifying. And the stories and essays in here are just beautiful. Really eye-opening and fascinating, and you're getting some legendary names here as well. I read some of Twilight. It's not very good. It's way more boring than I expected it to be, and I read it for my 20,000 sub celebration, and it was kind of a letdown because I couldn't really get angry at it. I couldn't bear to finish it because I was bored. Next. Anno Dracula is absolutely wonderful, but I didn't actually finish it. It's a little bit too long, and it lost steam. But I talked about this in a full-length video that you can go watch. I still think this is an absolutely wonderful novel. It is a fascinating piece of alternate historical fiction, fan fiction, a love letter to Dracula, to Bram Stoker, to Victorian literature. It's a really fascinating novel. Anno Dracula is set in a world where Dracula actually won in the novel. He defeated the whole party. He killed Van Helsing and put his head on a spike. And now he has moved to the UK, turned Queen Victoria into a vampire, and married her to become her prince. And so he and Queen Victoria are steadily fascismizing the UK. They are turning it into a world of vampires. This is a book about police corruption. It is a book about empire in some ways. but it's also a dedication to all of the things that the author clearly loves about the Victorian period. It's a book that includes real-life people like Bram Stoker himself and Oscar Wilde, as well as fictional characters like Sherlock and Mycroft Holmes and Dr. Jekyll. It's a fascinating piece of fan fiction, but it's also wonderfully politically clever. And the kind of through line of the novel is the fact that we have a vampire character and a human character both investigating the murders of Jack the Ripper. But in this story, the prostitutes that Jack has been killing are all vampires, and we wonder why and who he is. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely wonderful. I didn't finish it because, well, you can go watch my video on why I didn't finish it, but I still loved it. I still think it was a really fantastic book, and I had my time with it, and I really, really recommend it. The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward is another book that I've done a full video on. I found this to be a fascinating horror-thriller combination. I'm not big into thrillers. The only murder mystery books that I read are by Agatha Christie and a lot of Japanese authors. I love Japanese murder mysteries. So I was a little bit nervous about this because I didn't want to go into something that was just a gritty police drama, political thriller thing, the kind of things that dads read on the beach. That is not my thing. But it's not. It's a very clever pseudo-thriller horror combination thing, as I said. It tells the story of a man called Ted. At the beginning, Ted reminisces about the fact that it's been 11 years to the day since a young girl went missing at a lakeside near his house. He was a prime suspect, but the police couldn't find anything, his house was empty, he was cleared of all charges, and life went on. But now, in the present day, Ted lives in a quiet house at the end of Needless Street with boarded up windows, and he has a daughter that he sees periodically. His daughter is called Lauren, and she's kind of a tween, if people still say that word. She's like 10, 11, 12 years old. The two of them argue a lot, and she's not there all the time. And Ted sometimes says, right, it's time for you to go. And we assume, oh, she goes off to her mother, but we never hear a mother mentioned. And so we immediately assume, surely, this girl is one of the kidnapped girls from the lakeside. But that's way too obvious. That wouldn't make much of a thriller. So this book kind of misdirects you. It throws out red herrings. But those red herrings are not just random bits of misdirection. They loop back into the narrative. This is a very cohesive story. Everything in here is well thought out and kind of spherical. It doesn't shoot off in all directions. It doesn't wrong foot you and go, you thought that, no, forget about that. No, everything serves a purpose. It is so tightly constructed as an intimate and suffocating world. And there are real horror elements here. It feels very gothic, it feels very claustrophobic, it kind of feels like it's strangling you. I really love this book, and I actually have her next book, Sundial, ready to go. Next is a book that I don't have on me because I borrowed it from my girlfriend and I'm at my flat right now. But I did do a video on it that you can go watch. It's called Several People Are Typing, and it is a Kafkaesque science fiction horror comedy. It's a lot of things, and it's also a very, very quick read. This is a book that you can read in about 2 hours. It's kind of like watching a film, because the whole novel is written as a series of Slack messages. If you don't know anything about Slack or Discord, you pick it up as you read. And as I said in my video, I don't know if this book will age very well, because people in a few years' time might not even remember what Slack is. But it's very, very funny, and it really, really captures perfectly online discourse, corporate culture. The dialogue in it is so sharp and witty and snappy, and it really feels like it was just transcripted from real life. This is not an awkward story where the dialogue is what the writer thinks people sound like. No, this is genuine. This really feels like real life. And the story is really trippy. It's about a man called Gordon who works for a company in New York City, and one day he finds that his consciousness has accidentally been uploaded into Slack, and he's now trapped inside the app. And he tells his friends, he tells his co-workers, and no one believes him, and they all go, haha, that's very funny, Gordon, anyway. But no, he really is trapped in Slack. And it's very Kafkaesque in the sense that he's still expected to work, he's still worried about his job, and his performance actually goes up because he has nothing to do but be in Slack. But the Kafkaesque slips away, and it turns into something much more dark. And horror starts to bleed in as trippy, weird stuff starts happening, not just to Gordon, but to his colleagues as well. And the Slack bot plays a role as well. But it's also a comedy. I laughed out loud multiple times here. Several People Are Typing is very funny, and it manages to blend dark, Kafka-esque corporate discourse and commentary with real moments of horror and laugh out loud comedy. It's amazing. And it's also, as I said, a very quick read, and it's all written as a Slack transcript. There is nothing else. It's all in Slack. I'm really amazed by it. The only reason I read it is because I was in a bookshop with my girlfriend and she picked it up off a shelf and said, "Oh, this looks good." She read it in an evening, and then I did too. And I'm really glad that I picked it up. Several People Are Typing is just a lot of fun. Another book that I borrowed off my girlfriend, so I don't have it with me, is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This is also a book that's difficult to categorize in a genre. It's a piece of YA fiction. It's kind of post-apocalyptic. It's kind of horror. I guess you could call it YA horror. And I didn't realize until I finished it that it's going to have a sequel. It ends on a cliffhanger. But Wilder Girls tells the story of a school on an island off the coast of Maine. This is an all-girls school, and it has been ravaged by a virus called the Tox. It's been at least a year, I think about 18 months, since the viral outbreak, and now this school is just a place of survival. These girls and their teachers are all just trying to survive the virus, hunt the wildlife that's on the island, collect supplies that are sent by the Navy in a little crate, and just keep going, waiting for a cure, waiting for help, just surviving. Our protagonist is a young girl who has a best friend that she may or may not be in love with, and it's kind of teased and tiptoed around. A lot of the girls have died, a lot of the teachers have died, and there's a lot of body horror very, very early on. The Tox transforms and mutates your body, and it affects each person in different ways. One girl has her entire spine sticking out of her back, another girl's hand has been deformed and become monstrous, and our protagonist has had her eye fused shut. There are a lot of just creepy mutations or scars and twisted things happening to their bodies, and it has taken a lot of their lives. Early in the book, our protagonist becomes a member of I can't remember what they're called, the small crew of people that must go to the docks and collect the food package that arrives. And on the day that she becomes part of this crew, she unearths a few secrets. You know there's going to be secrets and twists and revelations, and her best friend gets sick, she has a flare-up of the virus, and she suddenly goes missing. She's not dead, but she was in the infirmary, and now she's not, and our protagonist wants to go find her. All of this is in the blurb, so I'm not spoiling anything. But it's a very simple, enjoyable piece of YA, kind of post-apocalyptic horror fiction. It's not actually post-apocalyptic because the world beyond this island is okay. But because we're trapped on the island the whole time and everyone's hunting for survival, it feels post-apocalyptic. But it's a really effective little YA horror story. It reminded me of The Hunger Games because I think we often forget that The Hunger Games is actually much smarter and darker than we remember, especially if we only watch the films. But you read the books, and there's a lot of really graphic violence. There's some really clever political allegories. Obviously, it's all very on the nose. But The Hunger Games was a really good selection of books that, I have to remind myself was really good. But this is similar to that. This has a very Hunger Games vibe to it, but it's not quite as smart politically. But I still really enjoyed it. Wilder Girls is a book worth checking out. This is Jawbone by Monica Ojeda. It was translated from the Spanish by Sarah Booker, and it is an amazing piece of Latin American fiction. It is dark, it is twisted, it is unsettling. I think that's the best word to use. It tells the story of a group of rich schoolgirls who are kind of bored, and they spend their time in an abandoned building where they create and worship this white god, and they dare each other to do ritualistic things. There's 4 girls, but 2 of them are really our main focus, and those 2 are also engaging in lesbian acts, I'll call it. But they also have a teacher who is heavily traumatized from her previous job at her previous school, where a bunch of girls did some really awful things to her. And now at this new school, fresh start, maybe, but no, because the book actually opens with the teacher having kidnapped one of these girls and taken her to a cabin somewhere in the wilderness and tied her up. So this is messed up. But it's fantastic as well. It explores cult dynamics without there being an actual cult, but the kind of cult behavior of people. It explores the way that our relationships can be extremely toxic, the way that trauma can mess us up, and the way that trauma can kind of be passed on. Although I don't love that concept myself, but it's still interesting to explore. Jawbone is really, really clever. I urge you to go watch my full video review for more, but I really, really love the way that this book was written. It's absolutely gorgeous, wonderfully translated, and very, very smart. Orpheus Builds a Girl by Heather Parry is my favourite book of 2022. I really don't think anything can beat it. Go watch my full video review if you want to. I've also added this to a bunch of lists and articles and stuff on our blog. Orpheus Builds a Girl is incredible. This is inspired by a real-life case where a doctor treated a girl who had TB and she died in his care. And then, shortly after, because he had fallen in love with her, I guess, he went to her grave, dug up her body, and kept it in his house for 7 years. Heather Parry read about this story, was annoyed about the fact that people frame it as a love story, and so she rewrote it as a novel where she is sort of setting the story straight. So we have a dual narrative where we have the doctor's story, his biography, his tale, his life, and then the story of the sister of the girl who died of TB. The doctor hailed from Germany and moved to Florida after World War II. The sisters and their whole family moved from Cuba to Florida around the same time, and eventually these stories overlap. And the way that the book is framed is that we're primarily getting the doctor's perspective, his biography. But after each chapter, the sister interjects and says, here's what really happened. Here it is from my perspective, my sister's perspective. This is about justice. And it's also absolutely gorgeously written, beautifully gothic, and very, very evocative of my favourite novel, Frankenstein. In some ways, this is a true follow-up to Frankenstein. I've never read anything that is written exactly in the way that Mary Shelley wrote, that captures so many of the 19th century Gothic vibes, of science fiction, of body horror, of love that is not love at all, but is in fact hatred and cruelty and abuse, and violence. This is a dark, twisted, claustrophobic, gorgeous piece of Gothic fiction. Although it was written this year and it's set in the 20th century, this is a love letter to 19th century Gothic. It is gorgeous, and I cannot say enough about it. I loved Orpheus Builds a Girl so much, and I went to meet Heather Parry. I already knew her through Twitter, but I got to meet her, listen to her and Julia Armfield have a chat about this book. It was an incredible evening. I'm so glad I finally met Heather. She's an amazing writer, visionary, wonderful, incredible human being. And this book is amazing. My favourite novel of 2022, easily. I also recently read Mother Thing by Ainsley Hogarth, who is a Canadian writer, and my video will be going up very shortly. This is fantastic, but it's very, very triggering, or it has the potential to be triggering. If you don't get along with your family, and especially your in-laws, tread carefully with this one. This is a ghost story about a young Canadian woman who is married and has moved in with her mother-in-law, who doesn't treat her very well, but her husband said, please, can we move in with my mum? She's not doing very well. She's struggling with her health, her mental health. And at the very, very beginning, in the first page of the book, our protagonist's mother-in-law has taken her own life. She opens up her wrists in the basement. And now her ghost is haunting the basement, is haunting the couple. This is a novel about a lot of things. It is about what patriarchy does to the roles of women as mothers, as wives, as daughters. It is about the toxic relationships between in-laws. That is mostly what it's about, but there's a lot of layers beneath that, like why these relationships are toxic. And it goes into some creepy Oedipal stuff, because that's often at the heart of it. Mothers and sons often have creepy relationships. The mother-in-law never believed that our protagonist could ever be good enough for her son, and she continues to believe that after death. But this book gets dark and twisted in ways that I did not expect. It is not all about the mother-in-law. In the second half, our protagonist, read it and find out. I loved Mother Thing. Go watch my video when it comes out. Wow. And this big massive bastard is one of the best things I've read this year. This is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. Holy goodness me. This is a 700 plus page epic. It is horror, it is political, it is about family and trauma, and it is an absolute massive masterpiece. Mariana Enriquez has written 2 short story collections that have been published in English, both translated by Megan McDowell, and now we have this giant horror epic. It is set during and after the military dictatorship of Argentina, and it begins with a man called Juan who is trying to keep his son Gaspar safe from a cult that Juan has been forced to kind of work for as a spirit medium all his life. Juan is in his 30s, and when he was a child, he was wrangled into this cult, and now he's trying to keep his son safe because he can already tell that his 6-year-old son is showing those same medium powers. The cult is real, the powers are real, and the eldritch god that they worship, called the Darkness, is also real. And this cult is made up of the most powerful, rich, privileged people in Argentina. And what they're trying to do is hold on to their power, consolidate their wealth, and even hopefully reach immortality. When the novel begins, it's very Lovecraftian, very cosmic horror, because it's about a cult worshipping an eldritch god. But it's also about family and inherited trauma and power and politics, the rich versus the poor, commodification of human bodies and what capitalism does to us, the way that it drains us dry. And then as it goes on, it becomes very Stephen King-esque. In the midsection, it feels like It, a massive, bloated, slow burn piece of creeping horror. Especially once we start following Gaspar's journey, it really feels like It in the midsection. And then after the halfway point, it starts to feel like a piece of dark academia as we move backwards into the history of the cult. And then it feels very Secret History. I love this book so much. Please go watch my full review. I can't say enough great things about it. And then I read 3 manga. One of them was called Momo Something Something. It's a vampire manga that I wanted to read for Halloween, and it was alright. I actually don't remember it now. A man, he's a detective, he's hunting a vampire, then he gets saved by a young vampire woman. He has become a vampire now, I think. And he's doing some revenge. God, I can't remember. I wrote about it. I added it to a few articles on my blog shortly after I read it, and I have since forgotten everything. Momo something something. It was fine. Moving on. Then I read 2 manga that I really, really enjoyed. One is a brand new, I think, shonen manga called The Elusive Samurai. It is set in 1333 at the moment that the Kamakura shogunate fell. Kamakura was the political heart of medieval Japan. And the manga begins with the man who is in charge of the army of Kamakura betraying the entire shogunate. And our protagonist is the prince of the shogunate, and he has to run, he has to hide, and he is now going to take revenge. It's a very dark and bleak opening. It really, really hits you hard. You see his father dead. You see his town up in flames. But it's also a shonen manga, in the truest sense of the word. The writer created Assassination Classroom, which is a really fun and kind of frivolous shonen manga, and he's followed it up with this. But despite the weighty emotional beginnings, it turns into something fun, kind of flamboyant almost. Our Elusive Samurai is called that not just because he escaped, but because his skill as a child lies in the fact that he can run and hide really well. This whole story is about the fact that he has no swordsmanship or archery skills. He just runs and hides. That's his whole thing. It's very, very fun. It's very sweet, it's beautifully drawn, and I love historical manga. There's not enough of it. Manga set during the medieval period of Japan, I will chew it all up. And this is one of them. The Elusive Samurai is a really fun shonen manga. If you want a brand new shonen manga and you like historical stuff, you like samurai and ninja, I recommend this one. And then one of the latest things that I read was a manga called The Girl from the Other Side. This is a gorgeous manga. It's a simple fantasy fairy tale. It tells the story of a world split in two. You have the insiders and the outsiders. The insiders live in walled-up cities, and the outsiders are supposedly cursed monsters who can spread their curse by touching people. But our protagonists are an insider who is a young girl and an outsider who is a really sweet and caring monster whom she calls Teacher. And they live in a little cottage in the countryside together. And he helps her and he teaches her. And he's looking after her while she thinks her aunt is going to come to collect her. But in actual fact, she was simply abandoned there. The insiders leave the city and hunt outsiders. They think that the curse is spreading, that the curse has made it inside the city. And it's about their paranoia. It's a fairy tale with very, very obvious messages about judgment, about insiders versus outsiders, about othering people. It's a simple, sweet fairy tale story that I really enjoy. It's beautifully drawn. A lot of the time the dialogue is sparse and it lets its environment speak for itself. It's beautiful. I can't tell you just how lovely this little fairy tale manga is. The Girl from the Other Side is beautiful. Please check it out if you love fairy tale stories. Okay, that's it. That's everything I read in October, which is an awful lot of stuff. As I said, 12 books and 3 manga. Although I can't remember one of those manga. And I didn't finish 2 of the books. Anywho, if you want to support me on Patreon, I will put out more videos, I will spend more time, more money, just like I did with all that ridiculous makeup for my vampire video. I want to do more of that stuff, but I need Patreon support. So, if you want to support me on Patreon, I hugely, hugely appreciate it, and subscribe for books.